Hey guys, welcome into the 14. I'm Nick Cole, and we're breaking down every SEC football game in week 6 from a betting perspective. Today, we're talking about the Arkansas Razorbacks visiting the Ole Miss Rebels at Vaught Hemingway Stadium at noon on Saturday. This game will be televised on ESPN, and it features the number 12 team in the country and the number 17 team in the country, which is maybe something we didn't expect coming into the season. So it should be a good one. The betting line on this game, it opened at Ole Miss -2, and it has moved up pretty significantly through the week. As of the recording of this video, Ole Miss is favored by 6 points. And the over-under has moved from 71.5 at open down to 66.5. Let's bring in our betting analyst, Christopher Smith. Christopher, what are you thinking about this surprisingly good SEC West showdown this week?
Yeah, maybe the most interesting game on the slate, just in terms of forgetting the betting aspect of it and just looking at which game could be the most competitive in the SEC. And it should go a long way to determining the third best team in the SEC West. So why don't you tell us what the weather is looking like ahead of kickoff and then get into Nick's news and notes.
Sure. So the weather in Oxford on Saturday should be low to mid 80s. We'll obviously creep towards the high as that game moves along, being a noon kickoff at 11 local time. And not much chance of rain, so we should be good there. And winds are going to be between 6 and 8 miles an hour, so teetering on that edge of maybe having a little bit of impact, but should be fine. From an injury standpoint, look at Ole Miss. Wide receiver Jonathan Mingo missed the Alabama game and should be out again with a broken foot this week. And looking at the news and notes for this game, let's start this conversation, Christopher, with what a week for these two teams to have to play each other. Both teams found themselves on the national stage last week, one playing at Alabama, the other one playing at Georgia. Nationally televised games. They were both ranked really highly, both unbeaten entering the game, both hoping to maybe make a little bit of headway against what we thought are the two best teams in the country. And as it turned out, they are the two best teams in the country. And both of these teams got blown out and they'd be a little bit embarrassed. It's hard to say they're embarrassed based on how far they've come from where they were maybe a year or two ago. They're still really proud of where they're at with their records. But certainly the gap between an Alabama and a Georgia versus an Ole Miss or an Arkansas was apparent on the screen as you watch those games on Saturday. And so the unfortunate thing for these teams is one of them is going to have to lose a second consecutive game. So you're going to have a team that went from being undefeated in September to potentially losing their first 2 games. And then the last thing I would ask you going into this from a betting perspective is watching that Georgia game, that Arkansas-Georgia game last week. Did you get the same feeling that I did, that Arkansas might be one of those teams that needs to be playing from ahead in order to be effective? I mean, obviously we looked at them coming into that game as a line of scrimmage team. Sam Pittman's a former offensive line coach, and that's where they're going to win and lose games. And in this league, that's what happens. And they've run the ball really well. But I watched that game and I watched them get behind. And then when they're pressed to pass from behind and you're behind the chains and some downs, you start wondering, is this the type of team that can get down 14-0 and pass effectively enough to come back and win a game? And I asked that question because when you're playing a Lane Kiffin offense, there's the potential that early in this game you could fall behind. Do you see that as something that could hinder them coming into this weekend's game?
Well, I think this is a very interesting game in terms of the scheme and the styles of these teams. I mean, you saw Nick Saban at one point a few years ago get tired of facing all of these spread offenses that were using tempo and using space from sideline to sideline and speed, and said, fine, this seems like it's tough for defenses, so now I'm going to deal with my offense. Well, it's interesting because Lane Kiffin essentially pulled a Nick Saban and did the same thing with his defense. He had trouble with the Arkansas defense, which was basically using 3 down linemen and dropping 8 into coverage, a lot of zone. And basically Kiffin said, well, my defense is going to do that now because that was so tough for us to play from our offense that now my defense is going to do that. So it's interesting because Ole Miss's defense is essentially the same as Arkansas's now. They drop 8, they use six defensive backs very often. They're in nickel and dime all the time. They play bend, don't break, basically. And so both of these teams have practiced against this defense all year now. And the thing that this defense does very well is it prevents big plays. And the thing that it doesn't do really well is stop the run. So I think the offenses are a little different in that they're similar in that they basically have, especially with Jonathan Mingo out for Ole Miss, they both have one good receiver. And I think Arkansas has a better receiver in Traylon Burks, even though he's been hurt. But Ole Miss has a better passer in Matt Corral, but they're very similar. They have one good receiver, and both these teams want to run the ball. Now, Arkansas a little bit more heavily. They barely threw the ball last week, even when they were down to Georgia 37-0. They were still running the ball. So that tells you, what Arkansas wants to do right there. So the question to me is, you have two offenses that are going to go against defenses that are built to not give up the explosive play. And you have two offenses that are really predicated on the run, even though people may not realize that about Ole Miss. They're about running the ball right now. And so who's going to make the explosive play on either of these two offenses? I do think, like I mentioned, Burks has the best chance out of any receiver on this field right now in the passing game. And KJ Jefferson is 6'3", 245 pounds. And if I got to pick between him, he's averaging 5.9 yards per carry this season, and Matt Corral, in terms of who I think could make the more explosive run, I'm going with Jefferson. Now he's more of a physical runner than he is explosive, but I think Arkansas's defense also, this is year 2 under Barry Odom, and they've been in the same system for a while now. So if you ask me which defense do I trust to prevent the big play a little bit more, again, I'm going with Arkansas. And, I think we've both discussed on this show that we're fans of Lane Kiffin. We're fans of his offense. It's entertaining to watch. I think it's good for the SEC, good for us to talk about. But I watched the SEC conference teleconference with both of these coaches this week, and you got to wonder, is one of these teams going to beat themselves twice? Is one of the teams going to be so upset about last week that they beat themselves again this week? And, I think with Lane Kiffin at Ole Miss, the Alabama game has maybe surpassed the Egg Bowl for that program in terms of which game do they care about the most every year. And Kiffin seemed a little bit irritated and agitated and sheepish coming off the loss, especially with his pregame comments on CBS, whereas Sam Pittman seemed totally moved on, seemed totally steady, not very emotional. So, if I have to go with a guess on which team could maybe still have some residue from last week, I'm guessing Ole Miss is the more likely team to have sort of a hangover there. So, Nick, you tell me what you're betting on, and we'll get into our bets.
Sure. So let's start with the total first. You mentioned the bend don't break style for both of these defenses. With a number like 66.5, to me, they only have to bow up and in the red zone a few times for these teams to keep this number under 50 or under 66.5 rather. So I like the idea that, hey, we get a couple field goal attempts. These teams are running the ball more than you think, particularly Ole Miss running the ball more than you think. So I like the under 66.5 here. And that's not to say I don't think points are going to be scored here. I just think we've got a number high enough that we can comfortably both enjoy a Lane Kiffin offense and bet the under on this game. And to that point about enjoying a Lane Kiffin offense, I do think at home with just a better passing attack, if you're trying to break the tie here for me, I like Ole Miss to get right, and I'm going to lay the 6 points. How about you?
I'm taking the under 66.5 as well. One thing I didn't mention before is both of these teams are actually running at a slower pace than they did last year. And Ole Miss is still running at a pretty fast pace, but Arkansas was surprisingly one of the fastest teams in the country last year with the Briles at coordinator, and they've been very average with their pace this year. So another factor that leads me to liking the under, and I'll take Arkansas +6. I think you're going with the market here on Ole Miss. I think this game opened Ole Miss -2, so the market's clearly saying Ole Miss is the side. I just think this has gotten to be too high. And I think this game is a little bit more even than that. I mean, you're looking at 6, you're looking at saying Ole Miss is 3 points better on a neutral field. And I'm just not buying that right now. So it's not my favorite bet of the week, but I'll go with Arkansas +6. For Nick Cole, I'm Christopher Smith for the 14, and we'll talk to you soon.